The crowd's laughter cut through the New Mexico desert air like broken glass, sharp and merciless, aimed at a brown horse who had done nothing more than exist in a world that measured worth by appearances alone. The Riverside County Livestock Auction buzzed with the kind of cruel energy that only emerges when people feel safe in their pack mentality, their voices rising above the dust and diesel fumes that hung thick under the corrugated metal roof. This wasn't just any evening sale where ranchers came to trade workhorses and breeding stock. This was theater, and Thunder had unwillingly become the night's entertainment. The massive draft horse stood in the center ring under harsh fluorescent lights, his brown coat dull as old leather, his frame carrying weight that spoke of too many years with too little care and too much neglect. His breathing came heavy and labored, each exhale visible in the cool desert evening, while his tangled mane hung like forgotten rope over eyes that had learned not to expect kindness from the humans who surrounded him. The auctioneers tried to maintain some semblance of dignity, calling out his basic statistics in their rapid-fire cadence, but their words were lost beneath the wave of ridicule washing over the crowd. Someone near the back shouted about whether they should roll him to his destination instead of walking him, and the laughter that followed echoed off the metal walls like thunder before a storm. Others joined in with comments about his appetite, about the cost of feeding such a beast, about the foolishness of anyone who might consider taking him home. Thunder didn't flinch at the noise. He simply stood there, head slightly lowered, as if he had heard it all before, as if this moment was just another in a long line of disappointments that had taught him to endure rather than hope. But in the far corner of the auction barn, past the clusters of ranchers in pressed shirts and silver belt buckles, past the dealers calculating profit margins, and the curious spectators drawn by the promise of entertainment, one man watched with different eyes. Samuel Martinez leaned against the wooden rail with calloused hands that knew the weight of broken things, his weathered face reflecting none of the amusement that animated the crowd around him. He saw past the extra pounds and unkempt appearance to something that made his chest tighten with recognition. What he witnessed wasn't a failed horse deserving mockery, but a spirit that had somehow maintained its dignity, despite everything life had thrown at it. In Thunder's patient stance, in the way he held himself even as laughter rained down like stones, Samuel recognized the quiet strength that comes only from surviving what should have destroyed you. And in that moment of recognition, something shifted in the desert air, something that would change both their lives forever. The silence that followed the auctioneer's call for bids was more deafening than all the laughter that had come before, stretching across the barn like a held breath that threatened to suffocate the cruelty hanging in the air. Samuel Martinez felt the weight of 62 years pressing against his chest as he watched Thunder stand motionless in the center ring, the horse's brown coat catching the harsh lights like burnished earth waiting for rain. Every instinct Samuel had developed through decades of working with broken animals told him that beneath the neglect and extra weight stood something rare, something that the jeering crowd couldn't recognize because they had forgotten how to see with anything deeper than their wallets. The auctioneer's voice cracked slightly as he repeated his call, clearly uncomfortable with the extended silence, while Thunder's breathing created small puffs of vapor in the cool desert evening. Samuel's weathered hands gripped the wooden rail until his knuckles went white, memories flooding back of another soul who had once stood before a crowd of doubters. His late wife Maria facing the school board's budget committee 20 years ago, fighting for funding for her special education program while administrators dismissed her students as lost causes. She had taught him that worth wasn't always visible on the surface, that sometimes the most valuable things came disguised as burdens nobody else wanted to carry. The crowd began to shift restlessly, some people checking their watches, others muttering about moving on to the next lot. When Samuel felt something break open inside his chest, it wasn't a decision so much as a recognition, the way a compass needle finds true north without conscious thought. He raised his hands slowly, deliberately, his voice cutting through the murmur of impatience with quiet authority, as he called out a bid that made the entire barn fall silent again, but this time with shock instead of anticipation. Every head turned toward him, as if pulled by invisible strings, their expressions shifting from amusement to confusion to something approaching disbelief. Samuel kept his eyes fixed on Thunder, who lifted his head slightly at the sound of the bid, their gazes meeting across the dusty space in a moment of connection that felt both ancient and immediate. The horse's dark eyes held depths that spoke of endurance rather than defeat, of patience that had outlasted countless disappointments, and in that patient gaze, Samuel saw a reflection of his own journey through loss and loneliness. The auctioneer stammered slightly as he acknowledged the bid, his voice betraying surprise at the amount, while Thunder remained perfectly still, except for the gentle rise and fall of his sides. Samuel could feel the weight of every stare in the barn, could hear the whispered conversations starting around him. But none of it mattered now, because he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had chosen connection over comfort, purpose over practicality, and in doing so had begun something that would transform them both. The weight of what he had done settled heavier with each mile that passed beneath the worn tires of his pickup truck. The reality of his impulsive decision growing more solid as the auction barn's lights faded into the New Mexico darkness behind them. Samuel Martinez kept his eyes fixed on the ribbon of asphalt unwinding before his headlights, but his mind churned with calculations he should have made hours earlier, adding up feed costs and veterinary bills against a Social Security check that barely covered his own modest needs. The trailer behind him creaked and swayed with Thunder's movements, each shift of the massive horse's weight a reminder that Samuel had just bet his financial stability on an animal most people considered worthless. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, sagebrush and mesquite, creating shadowy patterns under a star-filled sky that seemed both infinite and intimate. Samuel found himself glancing repeatedly in his rearview mirror, catching glimpses of Thunder's brown bulk silhouetted against the trailer's interior lights, the horse's labored breathing still audible even over the rumble of the truck's engine. Something about that sound, the rhythm of an exhausted creature trying to find balance in an unfamiliar space, reminded Samuel of his own first nights in this house, after Maria's funeral, when sleep felt impossible and every breath required conscious effort. The turnoff to his ranch appeared sooner than expected, the familiar gateposts emerging from the darkness, like old friends offering welcome. Samuel downshifted carefully, feeling Thunder adjust his stance in the trailer. As they navigated the dirt road that wound through his modest property, the headlights swept across weathered fence posts and the small adobe house that had been home for 20 years, revealing a landscape that suddenly seemed both too empty and perfectly suited for what was about to unfold. When Samuel finally stopped the truck and climbed out, the desert silence enveloped him like a blanket, broken only by the distant call of a coyote and the soft sounds of Thunder moving restlessly in the trailer. The air carried the clean scent of sage and the promise of morning still hours away, while overhead the Milky Way spread across the sky like spilled flour on dark cloth. Samuel moved slowly to the trailer's rear gate, his hands steady despite the uncertainty flooding his chest, and when he opened the latch, Thunder emerged with the careful dignity of royalty stepping onto foreign soil. The horse's hooves struck the packed earth with sounds like muffled thunder, each step deliberate and measured, as he lifted his massive head to survey the landscape that would become his sanctuary. In the pale glow of the porch light, Thunder's eyes held something Samuel hadn't seen at the auction, a flicker of curiosity that cut through the exhaustion and weariness, like the first star appearing in twilight. For a moment, man and horse stood perfectly still in the desert night, two damaged souls beginning to recognize that sometimes the most important journeys start not with fanfare, but with the simple act of arriving home. The miracle of healing never announces itself with fanfare, but arrives instead in whispers, so quiet that only hearts tuned to brokenness can hear them, revealing itself through tiny gestures that accumulate like dewdrops until suddenly the world looks different in the morning light. Samuel discovered this truth during those first precious weeks with Thunder, when trust felt as fragile as spun glass and every small victory carried the weight of resurrection itself. The morning ritual became sacred between them, Samuel emerging from his adobe house with coffee steam rising from his cup, and Thunder standing motionless in the far corner of the paddock, two solitary figures separated by weathered fence posts and years of accumulated weariness. Samuel would settle onto an overturned feed bucket with the patience his late wife Maria had taught him, opening a newspaper to read aloud about weather patterns and local politics, while Thunder pretended not to listen. The horse's ears would twitch almost imperceptibly toward the sound of Samuel's voice, betraying an interest he wasn't yet ready to acknowledge, while his massive brown frame remained statue still, except for the gentle rise and fall of breathing that grew steadier with each passing day. Sometimes Samuel would hum fragments of half-remembered lullabies, melodies that emerged from some deep place in his chest, where sorrow and hope lived side by side like old neighbors who had learned to coexist. Rosa Delgado arrived on a Tuesday morning with her veterinary bag and the kind of gentle authority that made both animals and humans feel safer in her presence. Her examination of Thunder revealed what Samuel's heart had already suspected, that beneath the neglect and extra weight lived a creature built for strength and endurance, his bones solid as stone foundations and his heart beating with the steady rhythm of something designed to last. Her hands moved across Thunder's coat with the reverence of a sculptor discovering the masterpiece hidden within rough marble, and when she spoke of good structure and sound limbs, Samuel felt vindication settling in his chest like warm sunlight. The transformation began so gradually that Samuel almost missed it, appearing first in the way Thunder's coat caught the morning light, with increasing luster, as proper nutrition replaced years of inadequate care. His breathing deepened and steadied, no longer labored, but flowing with the easy rhythm of an engine finally receiving the maintenance it deserved. Most significantly, his eyes began to change, the dull resignation slowly giving way to something that looked remarkably like curiosity, as if Thunder was remembering what it felt like to wonder about tomorrow instead of simply enduring today. Each grooming session became a conversation conducted in the ancient language of touch and patience, Samuel's weathered hands working through tangles in Thunder's mane, while the horse stood perfectly still, absorbing kindness like desert earth, absorbing rain after a long drought. The fence line that had once marked a boundary of mutual wariness gradually transformed into a meeting place where Thunder would appear each morning with something approaching eagerness, ready to participate in the slow, sacred work of learning to trust again. The ghosts of unfinished conversations lingered in every corner of the ranch like morning mist that refuses to lift, whispering reminders of dreams that had been interrupted mid-sentence and love stories that cancer had edited with brutal finality. Samuel found himself thinking about Maria more often. As Thunder's transformation unfolded, the horse's gradual healing opening chambers in his heart that he had sealed shut 3 years ago when the last medical bill arrived and the house grew too quiet to bear. The parallels between his own journey and Thunder's became impossible to ignore. Two souls carrying invisible burdens that made simple acts like getting up each morning feel like climbing mountains in thin air. Maria had possessed an almost mystical ability to see potential where others saw only problems. Whether she was working with dyslexic children who struggled to read or nursing injured hawks back to flight in their makeshift wildlife rehabilitation corner of the property, Samuel remembered how she would sit for hours with creatures that veterinarians had declared beyond help, her voice soft as prayer, as she convinced them that healing was possible, that tomorrow could be different from yesterday. She had used that same infinite patience on Samuel after his rodeo accident shattered more than just his pelvis, when whiskey had become his primary medication and self-pity his full-time occupation. The ranch had been her idea, a place where they could grow old, watching sunsets paint the Sangre de Cristo mountains, purple and gold, where Samuel could raise a few horses and Maria could expand her unofficial animal rescue operation. They had planned to fill the paddocks with rescued creatures and the house with grandchildren. But cancer had other plans, stealing Maria's voice first and then her laughter and finally her gentle presence, leaving Samuel alone with 20 acres that felt as empty as a cathedral after the last prayer has been spoken. Watching Thunder graze in the golden morning light, Samuel recognized the familiar weight of carrying more than his body was designed to hold, the emotional equivalent of the extra pounds that had made Thunder the target of ridicule at the auction. Grief, Samuel had learned, was a kind of obesity of the soul, making every movement slower and more difficult, turning simple tasks into exhausting ordeals that left him breathless with sorrow. He had been walking through deep sand for 3 years, each day requiring tremendous effort just to maintain forward momentum. Thunder seemed to understand this kinship without words, often positioning himself near the fence closest to the house, as if standing guard over secrets that only broken hearts could recognize. The horse would graze quietly while Samuel worked on repairs, or simply sat on the porch with his coffee, creating a companionship that asked nothing and offered everything. In Thunder's patient presence, Samuel began to remember what Maria had tried to teach him about the difference between being alone and being lonely, about how healing happens, not through forgetting but through learning to carry pain with grace, rather than bitterness. Sometimes in the early evening, when the light turned everything golden and forgiving, Samuel would find himself talking to Thunder about Maria, describing her laugh or the way she hummed while making breakfast, and the horse would listen with ears that never judged, and eyes that seemed to understand that some stories needed to be told, not for answers but for the simple relief of being heard. The cruelty of small towns lies not in their isolation, but in how quickly whispered judgments travel from porch to porch like wildfire across dry grass, carrying with them the collective need to tear down anything that challenges the comfortable certainty of what belongs and what doesn't. Samuel had underestimated how swiftly news of his auction purchase would spread through the ranching community, transforming from simple gossip into something resembling a pilgrimage site for skeptics who needed to witness foolishness with their own eyes. The parade of visitors began 3 days after Thunder's arrival, starting with well-meaning neighbors offering condolences for his obvious mental breakdown and escalating to more pointed inspections from ranchers who measured everything by profit margins and practical sense. Jake Morrison arrived on a Thursday afternoon, like a storm system moving across the desert, his silver pickup truck gleaming with the kind of perfection that announced success before he ever opened his mouth. His expensive boots hit Samuel's gravel driveway with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his opinions carry weight, followed by 3 companions who shared his talent for finding fault in other people's choices. They positioned themselves around Thunder's paddock like a tribunal, their voices carrying the same cruel amusement that had echoed through the auction barn, as if Thunder's transformation into something approaching health had somehow made him an even better target for ridicule. Thunder stood in the far corner of his paddock, ears flicked back in acknowledgement of the unwelcome attention, but showing none of the panic or submission that might have satisfied his critics. His brown coat caught the afternoon sunlight with a luster that spoke of proper care and regular grooming, while his breathing remained steady and controlled despite the commentary flowing around him like poisoned water. The horse had learned something profound in his weeks with Samuel, that dignity could not be voted away by consensus, that worth was not determined by the loudest voices in the room. Samuel remained on his porch, coffee growing cold in weathered hands that wanted to form fists, but chose instead to remain still, watching this latest test of Thunder's character unfold, with the helpless fascination of a man witnessing his own judgment being weighed by people whose approval he had never sought. The familiar burn of protective anger rose in his chest, the same feeling that had surfaced when playground bullies had targeted the quiet kids in Maria's classes. But experience had taught him that some battles were won, not through confrontation, but through patient demonstration of a truth that spoke louder than accusation. Thunder's response to the scrutiny became a masterclass in the kind of strength that doesn't require violence or drama to assert itself. He stood with the composed patience of something that had survived worse storms than this, his massive frame radiating the quiet authority that comes from knowing one's own worth regardless of external opinion. The critics continued their commentary, but gradually their voices lost some of their certainty, the way bullies often do when their target refuses to provide the expected reaction of fear or shame. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the unwelcome audience finally departed, Samuel realized he had witnessed something remarkable. Not just thunder's resilience, but the way genuine transformation creates its own defense against small minds and smaller hearts, proving that some victories are won simply by refusing to be diminished. The most dangerous battles are often fought not with weapons, but with the quiet persistence of a different way of being, a truth so simple that it threatens the foundations upon which people have built their understanding of how the world should work. Samuel felt the weight of this confrontation building from the moment Jake Morrison's silver truck appeared again in his driveway, this time carrying precious cargo in the form of a 17-year-old boy whose eyes held the same searching quality that Samuel remembered from his own youth, before life had taught him to measure everything by its immediate utility. The father climbed out with the swagger of a man delivering an important lesson, while the son emerged more quietly, his gaze already drawn to Thunder's paddock with curiosity rather than judgment. Samuel had reached the end of his patience for spectators, treating his ranch like a roadside attraction, his protective instincts finally overriding his natural inclination toward politeness. As he walked down from the porch to meet them at the fence line, Jake Morrison launched immediately into his familiar lecture about fiscal responsibility and practical horse sense, his voice carrying the edge of someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience, while his son Brett stood slightly apart, asking genuine questions about Thunder's daily routine and rehabilitation progress that revealed a mind genuinely interested in understanding rather than condemning. The contrast between father and son became more pronounced as the minutes passed, Jake's criticism growing more heated, while Brett's fascination with Thunder deepened, the teenager drawn to something in the horse's calm presence that spoke to a part of his soul his father had spent years trying to harden. Thunder, for his part, seemed to recognize the difference in their intentions, approaching the fence with the careful dignity of an ambassador, representing a way of life that valued connection over conquest, gentleness over dominance. When Thunder lowered his massive head and allowed Brett to touch his soft nose, the moment crystallized into something that transcended words, a connection that bypassed all the practical considerations and economic arguments to reach directly into the place where wonder lived. Brett's face lit up with the kind of pure joy that reminded Samuel of Maria's expression when she successfully rehabilitated an injured creature, while Jake's bluster died in his throat as he witnessed his son experiencing something that couldn't be purchased or strategized into existence. The silence that followed stretched long enough for all three men to hear the desert wind moving through the sagebrush and Thunder's gentle breathing, sounds that seemed to emphasize the poverty of words in moments of genuine connection. Jake's aggressive posture gradually softened as he watched his son stroke Thunder's neck with reverent hands, the teenager's obvious delight forcing the father to confront the possibility that he had been teaching lessons that were technically correct, but spiritually bankrupt. Samuel recognized the conflict playing out in Jake's eyes, the same struggle between head and heart that had paralyzed him for years after Maria's death, the fear that choosing compassion over practicality was a luxury that men like them couldn't afford. But watching Brett's face glow with wonder as Thunder nuzzled his palm, Samuel understood that some investments paid dividends that couldn't be calculated on spreadsheets, yields measured not in dollars but in the restoration of faith that goodness still existed in a world that often seemed determined to prove otherwise. The fury that nature unleashes when it decides to remind humanity of its place in the cosmic order arrived without warning on a Tuesday evening, transforming the peaceful New Mexico sky into a battleground of wind and water that seemed determined to test every bond Samuel had forged with his newfound purpose. The storm descended like divine judgment, bringing marble-sized hail that drummed against the metal roof of the barn with the intensity of machine gun fire, while winds strong enough to bend the ancient cottonwood trees into impossible angles sent Samuel scrambling across his property to secure anything that might become a projectile in the chaos. Thunder stood in the three-sided shelter with the composure of a mountain weathering yet another assault from the elements, his massive brown frame radiating the kind of calm that comes only from creatures who understand that storms pass but character endures. Samuel found himself drawn to the horse's presence during the worst of the tempest, standing beside him in the shelter while lightning split the sky like cracks in black glass and thunder rolled across the desert with enough force to rattle windows miles away. There was something profoundly settling about Thunder's steady breathing and unwavering stance, as if the horse carried within himself an anchor that kept both of them grounded while the world convulsed around them. When the lightning finally found its target in a transformer at the edge of the valley, the resulting darkness felt less like loss than liberation, cutting the connection to a world of artificial urgency and electronic noise that had been humming so long in the background that Samuel had forgotten what true silence sounded like. The power outage stretched into days, but instead of inconvenience, Samuel discovered opportunity as Thunder revealed yet another dimension of his character, approaching the small cart that Samuel had dragged from storage with the kind of patient willingness that spoke of genetic memory reaching back through generations of working horses. Together they developed a rhythm that felt both ancient and essential, Thunder pulling loads of hay and water with the steady determination of a creature bred for partnership rather than performance, while Samuel guided and encouraged with the growing understanding that some relationships transcend simple ownership to become collaborations between equals. The work felt less like labor than like ritual, each trip across the property strengthening bonds that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with mutual respect earned through shared effort. The evenings became cathedral experiences, lit only by kerosene lamps that cast dancing shadows on the adobe walls, while Thunder grazed nearby under a canopy of stars, so brilliant that the Milky Way looked like spilled sugar across black velvet. Samuel found himself sitting on his porch longer than he had in years, coffee cup forgotten in his hands, as he absorbed a peace that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath his feet, understanding finally that sometimes the most profound healing happens not through dramatic intervention, but through the simple act of being present with another soul who understands that survival is only the beginning of the story. In those lamplit nights, with Thunder's gentle movements creating whispered music in the darkness, and the desert stretching endlessly toward horizons, unmarked by human ambition, Samuel felt something he had thought lost forever, a sense of completeness that had nothing to do with having everything and everything to do with appreciating what remained. The power of story to transform reality became evident not through grand gestures, but through the quiet persistence of truth. Told simply, the way ripples from a single stone dropped in still water eventually reached shores that seemed impossibly distant from the point of impact. Sofia Delgado arrived at the ranch on a crisp October morning with the earnest enthusiasm of 17 years and a school assignment that had evolved into something approaching mission work, her camera hanging around her neck like a talisman, and her notebook filled with questions that revealed a mind already attuned to the deeper currents flowing beneath surface appearances. Samuel found himself unexpectedly comfortable talking to this young woman, whose eyes held the same quality of genuine curiosity that had drawn Brett Morrison to Thunder weeks earlier, her questions focusing not on the sensational aspects of the auction rescue, but on the practical details of rehabilitation and the philosophy behind patient care. Thunder seemed equally at ease with Sophia, approaching the fence without hesitation and standing still for photographs, with the dignity of a creature who understood that his story had value beyond his individual experience, that his journey from ridicule to respect carried lessons that extended far beyond the boundaries of one small ranch. The article Sophia published in the Espanola Valley News captured something that Samuel hadn't expected anyone outside their immediate circle to understand, describing Thunder not as a curiosity or cautionary tale, but as a living example of how traditional partnerships between humans and animals could heal wounds that modern efficiency had forgotten how to address. Her words painted pictures of sustainable practices and gentle rehabilitation techniques, framing Samuel's work not as sentimental foolishness but as practical wisdom that combined economic sense with environmental stewardship and animal welfare. The response surprised everyone, beginning with phone calls from neighboring counties and expanding into visits from families who drove hours to see the horse that had become famous, not for winning races, but for demonstrating that second chances could transform more than just individual lives. Children pressed their faces against Thunder's paddock fence with the kind of wonder that reminded Samuel why Maria had chosen teaching as her calling, while their parents asked thoughtful questions about rescue techniques and the economics of compassion that revealed their own hunger for alternatives to the relentless practicality that had drained joy from so many rural enterprises. Thunder embraced his new role as ambassador with the same patient grace he had shown throughout his transformation, standing proudly for countless photographs and allowing small hands to stroke his neck, while maintaining the gentle composure that had first caught Samuel's attention at the auction. The horse seemed to understand intuitively that his story had grown beyond personal healing to become something that gave other people permission to believe in possibilities they had been afraid to voice, that his presence offered proof that gentleness could coexist with strength and that profit didn't have to come at the expense of principle. Samuel gradually recognized that what made him uncomfortable about the attention wasn't the intrusion on his privacy, but the realization that Thunder's story had always been bigger than either of them. That from the moment he raised his hand at that auction, they had become part of something that touched the universal human longing for redemption, for proof that broken things could be made whole again, that love could indeed triumph over indifference when wielded with patience and persistence. The moment when purpose reveals itself rarely arrives with fanfare, but tends to unfold like dawn breaking over mountains, so gradually that the transformation from darkness to light seems both inevitable and miraculous, leaving those who witness it wondering how they failed to see what was always meant to be. The phone call from Dr. Elena Vasquez at the Healing Hooves Therapeutic Center came on a Wednesday morning when Samuel was brushing Thunder's coat to its now familiar luster, the connection between them so established that the horse barely lifted his head when the phone rang, trusting that Samuel would return to finish what he had started. Dr. Vasquez spoke with the measured enthusiasm of someone who had learned to recognize exceptional qualities beneath unconventional surfaces, explaining how Thunder's story had reached her through the network of professionals who understood that some animals possessed gifts that transcended traditional classifications. She described children whose physical limitations made conventional horseback riding impossible, young souls who needed the security that only a truly gentle giant could provide, a platform stable enough to anchor their trust while they learned to believe in their own capability. The evaluation took place on a crisp November morning at the facility in Albuquerque, where Samuel watched Thunder encounter his first potential student, a 7-year-old girl named Isabella, whose cerebral palsy had taught her to navigate a world that often moved too fast for her careful pace. Thunder's response to her presence revealed depths of intuitive wisdom that left even experienced therapists speechless. The massive horse lowering his head without being asked so that Isabella could reach his mane from her wheelchair, his breathing slow and steady as she stroked his neck with hands that trembled not from fear but from the excitement of connection. When Isabella was finally lifted onto Thunder's broad back, Samuel held his breath as the horse became perfectly still, not the frozen stillness of tension, but the composed calm of a creature who understood that his passenger needed security more than motion. Thunder's massive frame provided exactly what Isabella required, a foundation solid enough to support not just her physical weight, but the emotional weight of believing that she could do something extraordinary, that her limitations didn't define the boundaries of her possibilities. Dr. Vasquez offered to purchase Thunder immediately, recognizing the rare combination of size, temperament, and intuitive sensitivity that made him invaluable for their program. But Samuel found himself hesitating not from reluctance to part with Thunder, but from the growing understanding that his own journey was far from complete. The horse had taught him about healing, about the patience required for transformation, about the way broken things could become instruments of grace when handled with sufficient care and respect. Standing in that therapeutic facility, watching Thunder work his quiet magic with children who had been told repeatedly about their limitations, Samuel realized that ownership had never been the point of their relationship. Thunder belonged not to him, but to everyone who needed proof that gentleness could coexist with strength, that second chances could bloom into purposes greater than anyone had originally imagined. The horse had become a living demonstration that healing was possible, that transformation could happen gradually and then suddenly, and that sometimes the most important work happened not in spite of past wounds, but because of them. The deepest truths about love often reveal themselves not in grand declarations, but in the practical arrangements that honor both independence and connection, creating frameworks that allow healing to continue without the constraints of traditional ownership or the finality of permanent separation. Samuel's proposal to Dr. Vasquez emerged from the same instinct that had guided him at the auction, the recognition that Thunder's value lay not in being possessed, but in being allowed to fulfill his purpose, while maintaining the roots that had made his transformation possible. The partnership they crafted became a bridge between two worlds, allowing Thunder to serve children who needed his gentle strength while keeping the ranch as his sanctuary, the place where he could return to graze peacefully under New Mexico stars and remember where his healing had begun. The twice-weekly journeys to Albuquerque transformed from obligation into pilgrimage, each trip revealing new facets of Thunder's capacity for intuitive connection with children, whose bodies moved differently, but whose hearts yearned for the same acceptance and understanding that Thunder himself had once needed. Samuel found himself staying longer at the facility, watching in wonder as Thunder adjusted his massive frame to accommodate a child with muscular dystrophy, or stood perfectly still while a young boy with autism whispered secrets into his patient ear. Conversations that seemed to bypass language entirely and speak directly to the place where souls recognize kindred spirits. Jake Morrison's transformation paralleled Thunder's in its gradual inevitability, the successful rancher's criticism slowly giving way to curiosity as his son Brett continued volunteering at Samuel's ranch, learning lessons about value that couldn't be taught in business school or measured on spreadsheets. Jake began appearing at the ranch without his usual entourage of supporters, standing quietly by the fence, while Brett groomed Thunder or helped with feeding, his expensive boots sinking into the same earth that had once seemed beneath his consideration. The day Jake finally admitted his error in judgment came not with dramatic fanfare but with the quiet honesty of a man who had learned that strength sometimes meant acknowledging when you had been wrong. The ranch itself began to reflect the expanding circles of healing that Thunder's presence had initiated, with Samuel implementing rotational grazing practices and water conservation techniques that Sophia had mentioned in her articles, finding purpose in nurturing the land that supported not just Thunder, but the growing number of visitors who came seeking their own connections to something authentic and healing. The property transformed from a place where one man had hidden from his grief into a demonstration site where sustainable practices and compassionate animal care created a model that other rescues began to study and emulate. Evening light painted the paddock gold as Samuel watched Thunder graze contentedly, the horse's coat now gleaming with health and his movements reflecting the confident grace of a creature who had found his calling. The sight filled Samuel with the kind of satisfaction that comes not from completing a project, but from recognizing that some stories are meant to continue indefinitely, growing larger and more meaningful with each chapter. Thunder had become more than a rescued horse. He had become a living proof that healing was possible, that second chances could bloom into purposes greater than anyone had originally imagined, and that sometimes the most important journeys began not with destinations in mind, but with the simple willingness to take the first step towards something better. Thunder lifted his head as Samuel approached, their evening ritual of connection continuing the conversation they had begun that night at the auction. A dialogue between damaged souls who had taught each other that broken didn't mean worthless, that weight could be transformed into strength, and that the gentlest hearts often carried the greatest capacity for healing the world around them. The legend that Thunder became was not built from gold trophies or racing victories, but from something far more precious, the quiet accumulation of moments when gentleness proved more powerful than force, when patience outlasted prejudice, and when one act of faith in the face of universal doubt created ripples that spread across the high desert like circles in still water, touched by falling rain. 2 years had passed since that evening at the Riverside County Livestock Auction, when laughter had filled the air like poison. But now, Thunder's name was spoken with reverence at agricultural conferences and rescue meetings across the Southwest, his story becoming a touchstone for anyone who had ever wondered whether kindness could survive in a world that seemed to reward only the hardest edges of human nature. Samuel found himself standing at podiums he had never imagined, approaching, his weathered hands gripping microphones as he shared Thunder's journey with audiences, hungry for proof that transformation was possible, that broken things could indeed be made whole again through patient application of love, disguised as daily care. The invitations arrived from places he had only seen on maps, organizations dedicated to animal welfare and sustainable farming practices, all wanting to hear about the methodology behind what they called a miracle. But what Samuel knew was simply the result of refusing to give up when giving up would have been easier. Thunder's physical transformation had been as remarkable as his emotional healing. The regular exercise and proper nutrition revealing the magnificent frame that had always existed beneath years of neglect. His brown coat now gleaming like polished mahogany in the New Mexico sunlight. The excess weight that had once made him a target for ridicule had melted away to reveal the noble architecture of a creature bred for strength and endurance. His movements now carrying the fluid grace of an athlete in his prime, his eyes bright with the contentment that comes from understanding one's purpose in the greater scheme of existence. The therapeutic riding program had expanded to accommodate Thunder's popularity, with families driving from across the region to give their children the opportunity to connect with a horse who had become living proof that limitations were often just starting points for different kinds of excellence. Samuel watched these sessions with the wonder of someone witnessing daily miracles, seeing children discover confidence they hadn't known they possessed, watching parents rediscover hope they thought they had lost, understanding that Thunder's greatest gift was not his size or strength, but his ability to see past surface differences to the universal need for acceptance and understanding. On quiet evenings, when the work was finished, and the desert air carried the mingled sense of sage and possibility, Samuel would stand beside Thunder in the paddock. They had both learned to call home, two souls who had saved each other without ever using that word aloud. The silence between them held more conversation than most people managed with thousands of words, a communication built on shared understanding of how precious second chances could be when received by hearts brave enough to risk hoping again. Thunder would graze peacefully while Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of contentment, grateful for the stubborn voice inside him that had refused to let the laughter of small minds drown out the whisper of a heart that recognized another soul in need of saving. In rescuing Thunder, Samuel had discovered the path to rescuing himself from the prison of grief and loneliness that had held him captive since Maria's death, learning that healing was not a destination but a daily choice to choose connection over isolation, purpose over despair. The legacy they built together would outlast them both, living on in the children who had learned to trust through Thunder's patient example, in the rescue organizations that had adopted their partnership model, and in every person who had witnessed their story and chosen to believe that gentleness was not weakness, but the highest form of strength, that second chances were not just charity, but investments in the possibility that tomorrow could always be better than yesterday. If this story of Thunder and Samuel touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe for more tales of unexpected redemption and the quiet heroes who prove that kindness can indeed change the world. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.